Here to assess the 2012 legislation and its impacts on K-12 education, we have Commissioner Brenda Cassellius. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Julie. I'm glad to be here.
Commissioner, before we get into the legislative action and inaction, I want to ask you first about this new rating system. Earlier in the year, Minnesota was granted a waiver from No Child Left Behind. So what's new in regard to rating our schools and what's next in this direction?
Well, we're really excited about the new waiver possibility here for our schools in terms of really being able to focus on a smaller number of schools with the greater capacity across the entire state and get schools networked together, sharing best practices. And so that's new. It's going to be more of a systemic type of approach at helping schools improve. So we're really excited about that. We also believe it's a fair way to measure our schools and a better way to measure our schools to give more accurate data points around student growth. And so we just think that that is going to be something that's going to be useful for teachers as they work with individual schools and as they work to improve their schools overall.
And so as you look at rating these various schools and identifying the ones that need a little more help trying to close the achievement gap, would more funding be allocated to these schools as well, or just more attention drawn to them?
Well, we'd like to have more funding, so I can always advocate for that. But no, there's not more funding concretely, but there is more flexibility in how they use their funds. So there will be flexibility. Before, schools would have to set aside 20% of their funds and give that outside of the school system. Now we can invest that money right in the classroom where we know that that will have its greatest impact. So we're excited about that opportunity to be able to find creative ways to work with teacher effectiveness. We just passed evaluation last year. We know schools are going to need these extra resources. We know in scarce times they need to have greater flexibility with how to use their funding to do more innovative approaches with those students who have been underperforming. So we're we're looking forward to this new model.
It's fair to say that it doesn't matter what party legislators are a part of, everybody wants to close this achievement gap. And one way that was passed and signed into law was kind of modifying and solidifying the early literacy program. So talk to me a little bit about that and how you think that's going to impact students. And do you think that was the greatest education reform component passed last session?
Well, I do think last session we were really fortunate that the governor and Chair Olson had such a great working relationship and had shared a passion around reading and literacy. And so the governor and myself, as well as Senator Olson, really worked on revamping our third grade reading bill. And we looked at all districts having district-wide literacy plans, having interventions earlier for students because we don't have our state accountability test until third grade. Well, that's too late. So now we've asked school districts to assess student learning much earlier, and then we're rewarding it. So we invested $49 million in rewarding schools that are seeing students receive and be proficient, as well as still continuing their growth from third to fourth grade. And then there's another really exciting thing that the senator was supportive of, as well as myself, and that's the Reading Corps. This is getting, that was a $5.5 million investment, getting more coaches working with our struggling readers and our schools around best practices for learning how to read earlier.
Let's talk about the cornerstone excuse me, of the GOP's education reform package, which was last in, first out. It was vetoed by the governor, and for the sake of our viewers, it essentially added criteria that school districts could use to consider when teacher layoffs were pending. So the focus wasn't just on seniority. Did you think LIFO was a bad idea, or do you think it merits maybe a further look in the future?
I think that the timing was not right. We had just passed teacher evaluation last year. We have to get that right. We see other states kind of backstepping off of their teacher evaluation systems. We know that there's a lot of good work ahead of us with our teacher evaluation task force. We also want to make sure that we get our principal evaluation in place first, because it's the principals that have to then evaluate teachers. So we want to make sure we have great principals who have great evaluations for teachers and know how to do those evaluations. So there's a couple of steps before we get to that point of using evaluations to determine layoff. And really the bigger question is, let's not get in a situation of layoff. If we resource our schools, talking about money, adequately, then we'll never be in a situation of layoff. If a teacher is not doing well, we shouldn't be waiting until layoff to move them out of the classroom. We should be evaluating them out. And so that's kind of the philosophy behind our position.
You brought up a task force, and let's talk a little bit about the Integration Aid Task Force. Roughly 140 Minnesota schools do receive more than $108 million in integration aid. That money goes away right now as of June of 2013. Now, there was a task force that did make recommendations to continue funding, but put more pressure on schools to prove results. Lawmakers didn't act on any of those suggestions. So are you in favor of maybe continuing integration aid in the future, or moving away from it altogether?
So this was one of the things in last session that the governor and I really stood strong on, is that integration aid is important. We are becoming a much more diverse society. If you saw the papers just recently, you see that our children under the age of 1 are the majority. Children of color are the majority. So at some point we have to address the issues of leaving 40% of our children behind. We can no longer as a state allow that to happen economically or morally. So it's very, very important for us to address this issue, and it's the only money that's set aside to attack the achievement gap, which in Minnesota we know is our problem. We need to ensure all kids learn and all kids reach their potential. That's absolutely our #1 priority. And so the $108 million, Julie, doesn't go away. It is still there, it's dedicated. It just needs to be repurposed. To what purpose do we use it? So the dollars don't just...
My understanding was it sunsets.
It does sunset, but the money is still there and has to be repurposed.
Okay.
So
they don't
the policy,
use 108, it could just go into
so
a
it has
area.
to be rededicated and repurposed, but the pot of money is still sitting there to be used.
Thank you for that clarification. I do want to ask you, May 15th, an editorial in the Star Tribune stated that on K-12 issues, the 2012 Minnesota legislature will likely be more remembered for what didn't happen than for what did. Would you agree with this?
Well, you know, there wasn't any real delicious items that happened like last year. You know, we added more money to the per pupil formula last year. We had teacher evaluation, and these were all bipartisan supportive things. Early childhood scholarships. I mean, we did so much last session that this session we kind of did some tweaks and some fixes to some of the stuff we did last year, like early scholarships, literacy aid, the Career Technical Ed Levy. We did those things, but we also did a few other things. PSEO, we did an expansion to 10th grade. We had the military differential pay for teachers who get called to service. That was really an essential thing, that our military personnel not lose money for serving our country. And we did a few other things like early learning literacy program and supporting that, so that in-home programs, so that we can have people go in the home and start working in language with mom and baby at 18 months. So there are some really exciting things that came out of this session, but maybe not as big as what people would have seen as last year.
Something else that came out of this session, there was a lot of discussion about paying back the school shift, and perhaps sooner than how it's already intended to be paid back, by using a variety of sources of revenue, including some gambling money. That came up at one point as well. So just generally speaking, are you in favor of paying back that shift sooner rather than later if the money came from something like gaming or racino, or it doesn't matter where it comes from, in your opinion?
Well, you know, we absolutely want to pay back the shift. Schools want to be paid back. They've actually, superintendents told me I'd much rather have them put more money on the per pupil than pay back the shift, because they've accounted for that, because that's ongoing dollars, you know, forever. So an increase in the per pupil formula is preferred by school districts. However, we do want to pay back the shift, but we want to do it responsibly. And in terms of gaming, you know, those aren't my decisions to make in terms of political decisions. That's for legislature to make. But in my own personal opinion, you know, gaming is something that is very difficult and challenging, I think, in terms of what it teaches our children. So I've never been much support of that personally, in my own personal opinion. But that to say, you know, those are not my decisions to make.
Understood. So I have time for 2 more questions. One is, next year, it is a budget year. You were talking about trying to increase per pupil funding, or, you know, that the intent would be to try to get that increased. Is that something you'll advocate for?
Of course. I mean, I'm Commissioner of Education.
Silly question.
But we just received a grant from the...
How realistic is it to advocate for that?
Well, we just received a grant from the National Governors Association, and we're really going to look at a structural fix to our schools and come with some recommendations for the governor this fall. So we're hoping. I know that the governor was able to make a $132 million investment in a $5 billion deficit last year. Seeing that we'll have a deficit again next year, priorities, you know, you have to create your priorities. I'm not sure which way the governor will go, but I know that education is a priority for him, and he'll be looking for every way he possibly can to increase funding to schools, as well as for social services. So those are his priorities. He wants a better Minnesota, and to do that, you've got to invest in education, and he realizes that. But we'll see how it goes. And see if we have some great recommendations this fall.
Okay, we're just about out of time, but real quickly, I'd like to get your thoughts on retiring K-12 Senate Education Chair Jen Olson. 30 years of education experience walking out the door here at the end of the year. What are your thoughts?
Well, I'm sad about it. She has been a great partner, and you know, for 2 years we've been able to get an omnibus bill, and I think that's a lot of credit to Jen and also her relationship with the governor and really being able to work through these issues. And so she's been a great mentor, and she's taught me a lot of things around legislating, and so I'm going to miss her. Also miss Mindy Greiling as well, chair of the Finance Committee for so many years, and her wisdom. So that will be sad to see those two individuals go. However, I know that there will be many ways, just like in education, to recycle people and get their wisdom and bring them back. So we'll make sure that we include them. She's very passionate about career technical ed. We're going to be doing some great work with that next year. And so hopefully she'll lend us some of her great ideas with that.
Commissioner Brenda Cassellius, thank you for taking time out of a very busy schedule to discuss the impact of the legislature on education. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.